All right, guys. Hopefully, y'all can put up with my Sunday morning bedhead here. But we're going to look at our first lesson, which is the converging cultures of America. All right. So, what I want to do here is I want to start this presentation, and we're going to be looking at converging cultures, prehistory to 1520. So, when we look at America, we're going to have a mixing of cultures. And that's what this converging means. We're going to have several different cultures coming together in America. And this starts to happen even before recorded history. All right. So before we get too far into it, let's talk about human beings and how they've migrated across the planet. Okay. So if we look at this chart, this is a chart of human migration. The numbers that you see here represent how many thousands of years ago people were living in these areas. All right. So if you look in Africa, you see that almost 200,000 years ago, you had humans in these areas. And they start to migrate out from Africa into the Middle East, into India, Australia, into Europe. Okay. And eventually, some of these humans are going to migrate all the way up here into this northern region. Now, this big 25 right here means that about 25,000 years ago, human beings were here. Okay. Now, they were down here too, but human beings had made it here. All right. That's where we want to focus for these next few slides. All right. People migrated to the Americas somewhere between 10 and 30,000 years ago, but we think it's more like 22 to 23,000 years ago. How do we know this? Well, to learn the origins of ancient people, we study artifacts, we study bones, we look at DNA if we can, we use radiocarbon dating to determine age. All right, so that's how we know how many years ago these things happened because we have scientific processes that can help us estimate the age. All right. Um, and during the last ice age, if you think about an ice age, right, like you think about the water cycle. So water evaporates, it forms into clouds. There's precipitation, rain comes down to earth, it goes to the rivers run back to the oceans. You have this water cycle, right? When the earth is colder, a lot of that precipitation gets trapped on land instead of making it back to the oceans. It's trapped in snow, it's trapped in glaciers, all right? So when more of that water is trapped on land, the ocean levels drop. All right, when the ocean levels dropped, this exposes a more it exposes more land, and this exposed a bridge, a land bridge between what is today Alaska and Siberia. Okay, we think people crossed over that bridge over a period of time, uh, searching for food, following herds of animals. All right, things like mammoth, caribou, bison, ox, etc. So these hunters would travel across land following these animals. All right. Now, if you think back to the first map that we looked at, okay, this section here, where we said that 25,000 years ago people had made it here, that's what we're looking at when we get to this slide. Now, everything you see here in kind of the lighter yellow color, that's a recognizable landmass. That's Alaska today, right? And this recognizable landmass here is Siberia today. Everything you see in the darker green is water today, but back then, 25,000 to 15,000 years ago, this would have been land. So there's plenty of land here for people to migrate across into Canada and then down into the United States and South America. We call that land bridge Beringia, okay? And it was covered by water somewhere around 10,000 years ago, creating the Bering Strait. All right. And that's what you see today between Alaska and Russia is this Bering Strait. That water wasn't there 25,000 years ago, and therefore people were free to cross. All right. Now, that's a big step, but people are, if you think about that migration, why were they migrating in the first place? They were migrating to follow animals because that's their source of food. Then we have a big event called the Agricultural Revolution. This is when people learn how to plant crops. All right, why is this a big deal? Instead of following migrating herds of animals, instead of being hunter gatherers, people can now grow crops, which means they can stay in permanent settlements, right? The agricultural revolution leads to permanent villages, which leads to governments, which leads to cities, which leads to civilization, written language, financial records. Okay. When people learned how to settle in permanent villages, it meant that they could quit moving around, they had reliable food sources, and they could develop civilization. All right. Our first crops in North America were pumpkins, peppers, and squash, but the most important was corn, or maize, as it's called, because it could be dried into flour and stored and used later for bread. Okay? So we have the migration, then we have the agricultural revolution, and people learn how to plant and grow crops. They stay in permanent villages, right? Some of the oldest villages that we know are Native American civilizations. Some of the oldest North American civilizations we know are Native American civilizations. Okay? So we're going to go over some of those. The first is the Olmec. This is really easy for you to remember that the Olmec was the first known civilization in the Americas because Olmec sounds like old, right? Olmec and old start out the same. So that's a little thing that you can use to help you remember that the Olmec is the first known civilization in the Americas. They built large villages, temples, and you'll notice a common theme with all of these Native American civilizations. Many of them build pyramids, um, just like Egyptians built pyramids. Um, but the Olmec were located near modern day Veracruz, Mexico. I'm going to show you that on a map. And they built large monuments somewhere around 1500 BC, which is 3,500 years ago. Okay. This is a map of Mexico. Okay. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. This is the Gulf of Mexico. And here is where the Olmec heartland would have been, right there in the middle of Mexico. All right. Here's one of the monuments that we have that are attributed to the Olmec, and these were very, very heavy structures built many, many thousands of years ago. On to the next Native American civilization that you're going to need to know about. This is the Maya. The Maya started around AD 200. We need to remember that the Maya are mathematicians, which is another little trick that you can use to remember this for your assessments, is that Maya and math both start out the same way, just like Olmec and Old start out the same way. But they were mathematicians and engineers. They are known for their calendar. It's called the Long Count. We're going to look at that in a second. They also built pyramids and were a very warfaring people. Okay, so when you look at the Maya heartland, this is going to be more towards the Yucatan Peninsula. All right. Chichen Itza, Tulum, all these places. Tikal. Here's one of the pyramids that we have that's attributed to the Maya. Okay, and if you notice, these are different than the pyramids that you would see from Egypt. These are step pyramids. All right. Now, this is a visual representation of the Mayan calendar called the Long Count. All right. And it was a fairly accurate calendar. The next Native American civilization is the Toltec. They are the first to use gold and copper for art and jewelry. So if I'm to show you a slide at some point and ask you a question, which Native American civilization can we attribute to this slide? If it has jewelry, chances are it's going to be the Toltec. All right. You notice here on this statue, you see the earrings, okay? We said that the Toltec were the first to use jewelry. So, or at least the first to use jewelry made out of precious metals in the Americas. And then we have the Aztec, all right? The Aztec capital is Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan. And this is going to be an important Native American civilization for us in this class because the Aztec are going to be the major empire in North America when the Spanish come from Europe to the Americas and they interact with the Aztec. They were very imperialistic, meaning that they conquered the people around them. They used their military power to conquer others, and that term that we use to describe that type of behavior is called imperialistic. All right, and another thing about the Aztec that is well noted is the fact that they practiced human sacrifice. All right, so if you look on this map, Tenochtitlan would be where present-day Mexico City is, and that is the area that was ruled over by the Aztec. In fact, their empire spread a very large distance in what is today Mexico. You see here a couple artists' renditions of the human sacrifices practiced by the Aztec. They did so just like with any type of sacrifice. Religion is usually the motivating factor behind that. And that's how they appeased their gods, was by sacrificing people. Okay. The Hohokam used elaborate irrigation canals. They manipulated the earth so that they could grow crops. We talked about how important it was to grow crops if you wanted to stay in a permanent settlement. The way I always remember this is that if you want to remember which Native American civilization used irrigation canals, if you're going to dig a little ditch, you're probably going to need to dig that with a garden hoe, right? So the Hohokam are digging ditches, right? So just like you would dig a ditch with a garden hoe, they're the Native American civilization that digs irrigation canals, okay? And then your Anasazi is the last of these civilizations that we're going to look at today. The Anasazi started in the southwestern United States in what we call the Four Corners region. They built adobe structures in the Chaco Canyon. They're what we call a cliff-dwelling society, all right? If you look here at the Four Corners region of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, that is where your Anasazi would have been. You can see down here the Hohokam. They're the ones that used the irrigation canals. Okay? And here are some of the cliff-dwelling adobe structures from the Anasazi. All right? So hopefully this wasn't too much of a train wreck of a first lesson. After you have reviewed this lesson, make sure that you read the corresponding documents that go with it and have answered the questions. And we'll move on to the next thing. Hope you guys are having a good time.